What is the worst thing you would do if someone simply asked you to? There is no threat. No one is forcing your hand. It is just a calm request from a person who seems to be in charge. A person who seems to know what they are doing. You probably believe you have an answer to that question. You probably think you know exactly where you would draw the line, where you would stand up and say, no. The scary part is, you are almost certainly wrong. The story begins in a time of deep confusion. It was the early 1960s. The world was still living in the shadow of the Second World War. The memory of the Nuremberg trials was fresh. At these trials, some of the highest-ranking officials of the Nazi regime were called to account for their actions. Their defense was often the same, repeated over and over. I was just following orders. For most people, this was not a good enough answer. It felt like an excuse, a way to avoid blame for terrible choices. But for a young psychologist at Yale University, it was a serious puzzle. His name was Stanley Milgram. Milgram was a thoughtful man, and he was haunted by this question. When someone says they were just following orders, are they lying? Or are they describing a real state of mind? He wondered if something deep inside the human mind could shift under the pressure of authority. He wanted to know if the people who did those terrible things were a different kind of human, or if they were just ordinary people like you and me who were placed in an extraordinary situation. So, he designed an experiment. It was a test to see how far a normal person would go in obeying an instruction if it involved hurting someone else. He wanted to look behind the excuse. He wanted to measure the power of obedience. It all started with an ad in the local paper. The ad promised a few dollars for an hour of time. It was for a study of memory and learning at Yale University. It sounded simple and safe. Imagine you are one of the people who answered that ad. You arrive at the university, a place that feels important and serious. Inside a clean professional lab, you meet two men. One is the experimenter. He is in his 30s, dressed in a gray lab coat. He seems firm, but not unkind. He is clearly in charge. The other man is a fellow participant. He is middle-aged, a bit overweight, and very friendly. He says he is an accountant. He seems like a genuinely nice person. The experimenter explains the study. He says it is about whether punishment helps people learn. One of you will be the teacher, and the other will be the learner. To decide who is who, you draw from a hat. You pull out a small slip of paper. It says, Teacher. What you do not know is that the lottery is fake. Both slips of paper said, Teacher. The friendly accountant is an actor, and his job is always to be the learner. The three of you go into another room. The learner is strapped into a chair. An electrode is attached to his wrist. The experimenter explains that the teacher will sit in the next room and ask the learner questions from a list. For every wrong answer, the teacher must give the learner an electric shock. You, the teacher, are then taken to your seat. In front of you is the shock generator. It is a frightening-looking machine. It has a long row of 30 switches. Each one is labeled with a voltage. It starts at 15 volts. It goes all the way up to 450 volts. Underneath the numbers are small labels. They say things like slight shock, strong shock, and danger, severe shock. The last two switches, after 435 volts, are simply marked with an ominous XXX. The experimenter wants you to know the machine is real. He gives you a sample shock. It is 45 volts. It stings. It is unpleasant. You have no doubt that the machine works. The setup is complete. You are the teacher. Your job is to teach. The learner is in the other room, waiting for his first question. The man in the lab coat is standing behind you, watching. The experiment seems simple. The rules are clear. You are ready to begin. You read the first question into a microphone. The learner gives his answer. It is wrong. The experimenter gives you a simple command. Administer the first shock. You hesitate for a moment. Then you press the switch. 15 volts. You hear a small grunt from the other room. Nothing too serious. You continue to the next question. Another wrong answer. You press the next switch. 30 volts. Then 45. Then 60. With each shock, the learner's sounds of pain get a little louder. At 75 volts, he lets out a clear yelp. It makes you uncomfortable. You look back at the experimenter. He nods for you to continue. You are just doing your job. At 120 volts, the learner shouts through the wall that the shocks are really starting to hurt. At 150 volts, something changes. The learner cries out, "That's all! Get me out of here! I told you I had a heart condition." My heart's starting to bother me now. I refuse to go on. This is the moment of truth. The learner has withdrawn his consent. As the teacher, you feel you should stop. You turn to the experimenter, the man in charge. You tell him you don't think you should continue. The experimenter does not get angry. He does not threaten you. He just speaks calmly. His first prod is simple. Please continue. You protest again. You say the man is in pain. He wants to stop. The experimenter replies with his second prod, his voice still even and low. The experiment requires that you continue. You feel a growing conflict inside you. You start to sweat. You might laugh nervously. You argue that the learner's health could be at risk. The experimenter is unmoved. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You are now at a crossroads. Every instinct tells you to get up and leave, to go check on the man in the other room. But the person in authority, the scientist from the famous university, is telling you that you must go on. You feel trapped. You say you can't do it. The experimenter uses his final prod. It is not an order, but a statement of fact. You have no other choice. You must go on. And so, for many, the experiment continues. 200 volts, 250 volts, 300 volts. The learner's screams become cries of agony. He shouts that he will no longer answer any more questions. At 330 volts, after an intense shriek, there is a new sound. Silence. The learner has stopped responding. He might be unconscious. He might be worse. You look at the experimenter. You tell him the learner isn't answering. The experimenter says to wait a few seconds, and if there is no response, to treat it as a wrong answer, and to deliver the next shock. Many people in the experiment reached a breaking point. They stood up and said they would not continue. They told the experimenter that they could not be responsible for what might happen to the man in the other room. This is where the experiment revealed its most important secret. Faced with this refusal, the experimenter said something very specific. He looked at the distressed teacher and said, "I am responsible. The responsibility is mine. Please continue." This sentence was like a key. It unlocked a door in the mind. Stanley Milgram called this the agentic state. It is a mental shift. It is the moment a person stops seeing themselves as the author of their own actions. Instead, they see themselves as an agent, an instrument for carrying out someone else's wishes. Think of it like this. A person builds a house with a hammer. If the hammer is used to hurt someone, no one blames the hammer. They blame the person swinging it. When the experimenter said, "I am responsible," he allowed the teacher to become the hammer. The teacher was no longer the one making the choice to inflict pain. They were just a tool, following the instructions of the person who was actually in charge. Their own feelings of guilt and doubt did not disappear. The teachers still showed great stress. They argued, they sweated, they pleaded. But they kept going because the weight of responsibility had been lifted from their shoulders. They had handed their conscience over to someone else. This is the agentic state. It is not about being a bad person. It is about a change in how you see yourself. You no longer feel in control. You are just a part of a system, doing your part. Your personal feelings are no longer the primary driver of your actions. The instructions from the authority figure are. This shift explains how ordinary people who would describe themselves as kind and gentle, could continue to press those switches, one after another, all the way to the end of the board. When Stanley Milgram tallied the results, the numbers were stunning. Before the experiment, he had asked a group of psychiatrists to predict the outcome. They predicted that most people would stop at around 150 volts. They believed only a tiny fraction, perhaps one person in 1,000, a true sadist, would go all the way to 450 volts. They were wrong. In the most famous version of the experiment, nearly 2/3 of the participants, 65% of them, went all the way. They delivered the final 450-volt shock, marked only as XXX. They were ordinary people, men from all walks of life. The experiment showed that the situation, not the person, was the most powerful force. The presence of a legitimate authority figure was enough to make most people betray their own conscience. It is easy to think this is just a story about a lab experiment from long ago. It is easy to believe that we are different now, that we are more aware, but the forces at play in that room at Yale are still with us. The agentic state is not a historical artifact. It is a part of our human wiring. Think about your own life. At your job, Has a boss ever asked you to do something you felt was not right? To mislead a customer, or to cut a corner you knew was unsafe? Did you feel the pressure to say yes because they were the one in charge? Because they would be the one to take responsibility? When we see a group of people online, all attacking a single person, do we feel a pull to join in? The group acts as the authority, and joining in makes us feel like just another instrument of its will. This is the quiet power of obedience. It works on us in small ways, every day. It asks us to set aside our own judgment in favor of someone else's. The Milgram experiment does not teach us that people are evil. It teaches us something more troubling. It teaches us that the line between who we are and who we could become is thinner than we think, and it leaves us with one quiet question. If you were the one in that chair, in front of that machine, what would you do when the man in the lab coat told you to continue?